Glimpses of the Old West often focus on shootouts and packed saloons, but they rarely touch on how intimate relationships were negotiated during that time. Amid the noise of taverns, survival dictated roles, and methods to prevent pregnancy seemed more like curious improvisations than actual medical practices. Taboos emerged without a rulebook, leading to unexpected strategies and solutions that seem downright bizarre today. Prostitution was a natural part of the local economy, while privacy was a luxury few could afford. Gender and social roles rarely followed the rules we assume today. The harsh climate and daily struggles forced constant adjustments. Every corner of the Old West hid stories that sound like fiction, but were as real as the click of a revolver. It's an invitation to explore how, in such a brutal environment, sexuality reflected a need for control in a place where almost everything was at stake. The scarcity of women made saloons the ultimate gathering spots, bringing people together in search of companionship, and in many cases, something beyond mere entertainment. In the Old West, many women provided more than just companionship. They offered a kind of relief in a life filled with tension. At the same time, they faced daily dangers, with violence lurking around every corner and little access to health care. Some managed to save their earnings, hoping to buy a small piece of land or start a business, trying to break free from the cycle of vulnerability. These efforts showed a quiet strength and a deep hunger for change. These encounters kept the local economy moving, benefiting everything from taverns to boarding houses. For travelers passing through, it was a rare chance to experience human connection in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. But the weight of this system fell on the women, who lived under constant judgment and discrimination. Even so, it's fascinating to see how adaptation strategies and new forms of social organization emerged, proving that gender roles were always up for negotiation. Not everyone played by the rules. Some women, realizing the doors society had shut in their faces, took on male identities to gain access to rights, job opportunities, and basic safety. Just imagine someone deciding to wear men's clothes and carry a gun, not as an act of rebellion, but out of necessity. It was a bold move, but for many it was simply the only way to live with fewer restrictions. In the Old West, intimacy moved at the pace of survival, without the labels we use today. Relationships could form out of convenience, simple connection, or just the need for companionship. Between daily struggles and judgment, people made do with what they had, finding ways to bend the rules and carve out moments for their desires. In that kind of world, unexpected bonds flourished, proving that the need to survive often outweighed cultural and moral barriers. Even so, freedom had its limits, shaped by ever-changing community rules. Some towns enforced strict moral codes while others were more lenient, allowing things like cross-dressing or unconventional relationships. These contrasts show that, even in places dominated by conservative values, there was still room for those daring enough to walk a different path. No matter how Puritan a society appeared, there were always small loopholes for those willing to defy expectations. Privacy, on the other hand, was almost non-existent. Many families lived in single-room homes with no walls or curtains to shield conversations or personal moments. Life unfolded in plain sight, as if the world itself were an open-air stage. In that setting, every choice was public, and finding a moment of solitude was a rare luxury. Among the wealthy, daily life looked very different. Large houses with multiple rooms allowed them to separate public life from private moments, a luxury that only highlighted the deep social divide of the time. While lower-income families had to navigate shared spaces with little to no privacy, the rich could lock their doors and close their windows, creating a stark contrast in how people lived. This divide didn't just affect comfort. It shaped power dynamics and social status across the region. Interestingly, the lack of private space for those with fewer resources exposed behaviors and habits that would have remained hidden in other settings. This forced transparency pushed society to adapt, leading to customs and rules shaped by immediate necessity. Within this reality, another delicate issue emerged: healthcare and access to contraception. Many women relied on homemade remedies and questionable substances, hoping to avoid pregnancies that could make their already difficult lives even harder. It was a risky choice, reflecting the constant struggle between uncertainty and the need to push forward. In the Old West, women who provided sexual services faced constant danger, with little to no access to reliable medical care or protection against diseases and complications. Many turned to midwives or healers, knowing full well that the procedures they offered carried more uncertainty than safety. These difficult choices highlighted the heavy burden they carried just to maintain some sense of autonomy, and how, in the struggle to survive, their health was often an afterthought. At the same time, an informal network of shared knowledge developed among them. Tips about herbs and supposedly effective methods spread, creating a sense of community that tried to make up for the lack of professional support. But these bits of advice were also riddled with myths and misinformation. This mix of improvisation and a complete lack of guidance reinforced the reality that women's intimate health and well-being were not priorities, deeply affecting power dynamics and gender roles. Adding to this harsh reality, violence against women was a constant threat. Sex workers and indigenous women were especially vulnerable, facing physical and psychological abuse with little to no legal protection. In a world where justice favored white men, the voices that dared to speak out against these abuses were almost always drowned out by collective fear. Some women found ways to fight back. They built networks of solidarity and support, especially among those working in the sex trade. In some towns, working together provided protection and even a quiet act of defiance against the system, showing that they refused to passively accept the role of victims. These moments of unity, no matter how subtle, revealed a strength that grew with every small victory. At the same time, violence continued to cast a shadow over intimate relationships, where consent wasn't always part of the equation. Blurry social rules allowed abusive practices to thrive, while voices calling for change were often silenced. Even so, some dared to challenge gender roles and push boundaries, paving the way for the possibility of a less rigid society, as we'll see next. In the Old West, wearing clothes associated with the opposite sex wasn't just a form of self-expression. It was a way to survive and gain some independence. For many women, cutting their hair, wearing pants, and adopting a new name was like a passport to opportunities that were otherwise out of reach, such as working in mines or running businesses. Taking that step required planning and the courage to face a society that didn't take kindly to those who crossed gender lines. Men also challenged norms by wearing women's clothing, whether for theatrical performances or, in some cases, to avoid military service. Though these stories weren't widely recorded, they hint at a world far less rigid than we might assume. For those bold enough to break the rules, these acts became a quiet form of protest and a way to live with fewer restrictions. These stories also shed light on another fascinating question. How did people navigate sexuality and education in an era filled with myths and misinformation? With rumors running wild, many sought ways to understand themselves and others, leading to behaviors that still surprise us today. In this atmosphere of discovery, we begin to see just how diverse this period really was, offering valuable lessons about freedom and identity. In the Old West, there was hardly any room for open conversations about sex. Most people relied on myths and religious beliefs to explain sexually transmitted diseases, often seeing them as divine punishment. Dangerous remedies like using mercury were common, with little understanding of the risks, showing just how much misinformation shaped the era. With no accessible books or doctors, young people learned about sexuality through hushed conversations, usually full of taboos. In that kind of environment, staying away from any sexual contact was seen as the only way to prevent disease or pregnancy. Women were even more vulnerable, facing harsh restrictions and judgment that kept them from openly discussing their own bodies. Even in the midst of this, some voices dared to challenge tradition and push for more honest discussions about intimate health. The backlash was strong, but these efforts paved the way for a broader understanding of the body and sexuality. Slowly, signs emerged that people wanted more information, a shift that would lay the groundwork for more open conversations, even influencing the language of the time. In the Old West, talking about intimate matters required just as much creativity as surviving the harsh landscape. To get around taboos, people came up with euphemisms and lighthearted expressions, making it easier to have conversations that required a bit of discretion. Instead of saying things outright, two cowboys in a saloon might joke about riding off into the sunset when they were actually referring to much more personal encounters. This use of metaphors wasn't just about avoiding awkwardness. The language was often blunt, filled with double meanings that mirrored the tough realities of everyday life. There was no time for sugarcoating. People who couldn't speak openly used these phrases to keep up appearances while still getting their real message across. Despite its playful tone, this way of speaking helped build bonds and created a sense of shared understanding in a world where privacy was almost non-existent. The way each word was carefully chosen shows that language didn't just protect, it also connected people. In this way, it reflected both the contradictions and the ingenuity of a society that, despite its hardships, always found ways to express itself and form deep relationships. Now that you've explored some of the lesser-known and intriguing aspects of sexual life in the Old West, it's worth asking, what lessons can this era teach us? Despite so many limitations and adaptations, we see examples of resilience, creativity, and ways of challenging taboos that might still resonate today. Looking back at these stories can offer fresh perspectives on the past, and maybe even on the present. If this deep dive into history sparked your curiosity, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content. That way, you'll keep uncovering surprising facts that might just inspire you. See you in the next video, where another fascinating chapter of history awaits.